Trudeau gets an earful on defense spending, while the Navy is looking at deploying ghost fleets. This is the Great White North Report. So Trudeau managed to piss off the U.S. Senate, and apparently he got an earful on defense spending from nearly 1/4 of the U.S. Senate, so that's like 20 some odd senators. Lawmakers from both parties tell PM to come to NATO summit with plan to meet target. Now they're talking about the 2% GDP target that all countries must spend on their military. Now Canada is richer than some of these countries, so they actually spend more money than these countries, but given the size of our country and how many commitments we actually really do need, we have 3 oceans to protect and a large landmass. We should have a bigger military than we do, and hitting 2% should not be a big deal. So the Senate sent an unusually critical letter to Trudeau expressing dismay over Canada's level of defense spending. They pressed Trudeau to come to this summer's NATO summit with a plan to fulfill Canada's commitment to reach the alliance's long-standing spending target. So we had 23 members of the Senate from both parties representing a dramatic and public escalation of pressure from Washington over a long-standing bilateral irritant. Canada's defense spending has been sliding for years. I think it's been not since the 80s that we actually hit a 2% target. There was a time we were spending 3.6% of our GDP on defense back in the Cold War. We are now in the midst of another Cold War, and it's time to bring back our spending. I'd rather see us spending on defense than spending on some useless programs or feeding a bunch of useless people over in the Middle East. I would not send any more money to UNRWA. I'd rather spend on our defense. So there's been a lot of tensions within NATO over the spending thing, and Canada is not pulling its weight. In fact, among the Five Eyes, Canada is not pulling its weight. Canada and New Zealand are not really all that great in the Five Eyes compared to Australia, the US, and Britain. Now, Defense Minister Bill Blair completed what he referred to as a productive trip to Washington to promote Canada's new military strategy. I haven't really seen much of a military strategy, and obviously most of the senators weren't all that impressed by Bill Blair's strat when he came to promote his strategy down in Washington, which is why they get the letter. Canada will fail to meet its obligations to the alliance to the detriment of all NATO allies in the free world without immediate and meaningful action to increase defense spending. You know, Ukraine's in a war with Russia, which is dragging on. Yes, we've helped Ukraine out immensely. We also have a war between Israel and Hamas, which Israel is being incredible. I don't understand why the international community pressures Israel so badly on a war that Hamas started. If anything, other countries should be joining in with Israel, sending military aid to Israel to help them clear out Hamas sooner. Or if they're so damn worried about these people, why not get them out of there? Let them leave and bring them back when the war is over. Half of them are already considered refugees. What's the difference in sending them outside of Gaza? Close the refugee camps. I don't know why they're still there. Why aren't these people settled within Gaza itself? Why are there still refugee camps? Why is UNRWA still a thing in Gaza? These are questions I often ask myself. How can there be an UNRWA refugee camp in the West Bank when Israelis are just settling their people there? Because no one else is. Yes, there might have been some restrictions over land use, but for the most part, during the Jordanian period, these refugees should have been settled there. The problem is they've been fed this lie of the right of return to even their descendants, which is just ridiculous. But anyway, Canada's plan would bring defense spending to just 1.7% of GDP. That's what the senators noted. 2 decades after NATO alliances agreed to a 2% target as a minimal contribution. 2 decades and we're still not at 2%. This is what happens when you have a liberal government that overspends, and then a conservative government has to try and clean up the mess, get spending reined in, and then they have problems with things. They also suggested that Canada is moving too slowly to modernize the aerospace warning system in the Arctic, the NORAD defense system, saying the North American Aerospace Defense Command desperately needs an upgrade. That can't happen without Canadian cooperation. I don't know why we're not doing that. Though the Russians haven't really posed too much of a threat over the Arctic, right now the Russians have their hands full in Ukraine. and they've learning a lot of painful lessons that their military is not all that great. So with the upcoming NATO summit in Washington in July, this could cause Trudeau some headaches, and probably will. And it came from some of the closest allies of Biden in the White House. So the NATO summit's to lay out the priorities for the next coming year, and they will expect your government, every NATO member that has not met the 2% defense spending threshold, to have a plan to reach this benchmark as soon as possible. Now, our Defense Minister Bill Blair downplayed the Senator's concerns while speaking to reporters in Ottawa. Canada will be a ready and capable ally of NATO. No, we're not. We are so far behind in everything. It also includes senators who made appearance at the annual Halifax International Security Forum in the past. So they've been active trying to get Canada to up its national spending. Ambassador David Cohen from the United States takes a broader view that goes beyond the alliance's military spending target for member nations. We chose to look at Canada's overall commitment to defense, which has been a joke. Percentage of GDP that is spent on defense, we look at a wide range of other factors. So our new defense policy commits billions of dollars in additional defense spending over the next decade, which means it gets pushed. We're pushing it down the road because they can cut this back at any time. Last fall, they were trying to cut back defense spending because they ran out of money. The Liberals overspent in the fiscal year. They had to cut back millions of dollars from all sorts of departments. Defense was one of the hardest hit. Even with additional commitments, the government estimates that Canada will see military spending hit 1.76% GDP by 2930. Still short of the NATO benchmark. So it's not going to happen in the next 6 years. And Canada is working on increasing spending, according to Blair. Canada is on a very strong upward trajectory in defense spending. We know we got work to do. We've acknowledged that since day one. Really. That's when Trudeau decided to waste money by canceling the F-33 project and putting bidding up and then going back to the same damn airplane 5 years later. It made perfect sense. What a waste of money that was. Instead of just buying it right away when it was cheaper, now we're buying it when it's more expensive. So with NATO, we spend less on defense than almost any other country as a percentage of its economy. But because it's wealthier than most NATO members, Canada spends more in actual dollars than all but a handful of NATO members. The problem is we have too much bureaucracy in our military. And we wasted a lot of money on witch hunts over senior military commanders and the Me Too woke movement. All the sexual complaints against commanders, which happened like decades ago. Did some of them happen? Probably. But for the most part, some of these women were just looking to get in bed with the commander for advancement, and when it didn't happen, they got pissed off. When you put women in the military, you're gonna get harassment, sexual harassment of some kind. It's part of it. It's part of history. It's why, for the longest time, women weren't allowed to serve in the military because of this. And the U.S. is right. The U.S. is pleading for its allies to spend more on defense because the U.S. has spent tons of money on defense. If it wasn't for the U.S., Canada would have probably been invaded by the Russians by now, or the Chinese. They've been protecting us for years. And it's gotten to the point where the U.S. can't do it anymore. They're already spending more to pay off the interest on national debt than it does on defense. And their military industry isn't as good as it used to be. And they're now facing a new Cold War with Russia and China. So they got to clean up their own mess too, and they need us to help them out. That's why Trump was so feared here, because he was threatening to stop protecting Canada in case of an invasion. He would gladly sacrifice Canada for time in order to get their own defense ready. So I would rather see us spend more on defense than spend it on useless programs in other parts of the world. Foreign aid is one I would slash in half easily. There's a lot of countries out there that don't deserve our help, and we've sunk millions of dollars in certain countries that just will not learn, like Haiti. We've also sunk money in China for some reason, North Korea, Iran, Pakistan. Afghanistan was a big sinkhole, so was Iraq, Syria, Gaza, Lebanon, the West Bank. Like, why are we still continuing to sink money into sinkholes that get us nowhere? So I'd put an end to all those. Now, the Navy is doing something. They're looking at something good. They're looking to deploy ghost fleets of warships that don't need crews, which I've mentioned before, that using mini subs that can be remote controlled is a good thing. Now, the Ukrainians are using remote motorized boats to great effect in their war against the Russians in the Black Sea. They're cheap. You put a one warhead on it, send about 20 of these out there with a guy in somewhere holding a remote control, and most of them will get picked off, but one or two might get through. So the U.S. has been experimenting with uncrewed ships. Canada could be next. The U.S. used to be on the cutting edge of drone technology, going back 30, 40 years ago. All you have to do is read Tom Clancy's book, The Bear and the Dragon, to understand how far back the U.S. has been experimenting with drones. And drone ships are nothing new. In fact, it's just an idea of using like a motor, kids with toy boats, remote controlled boats in a pond. Just a little bigger. So the Canadian military is weighing how many and what kind of optionally crewed warships it will need in the future as drone technology and artificial intelligence change the face of naval combat. Vice Admiral Angus Topsheed said that while navies will always need large combat surface ships and submarines, Canada's allies have started to experiment with automated vessels. Think about it. Think about small automated vessels with a warhead attached to it, or with a couple of missiles attached to it that can be fired remotely, that are shallow draft in an enemy coastal waters or at a choke point, like the Malacca Straits, or the Straits of Taiwan, would make things hell for an enemy. So the U.S. has already tested unmanned surface vessels for the past several years, and the concept proved successful enough for the Americans to organize medium and large USVs into a squadron in the Pacific, which must scare the hell out of the Chinese. A second such U.S. naval unit will operate in tandem with traditionally crewed warships and expect to be assembled this month. So the U.S. is going to put up several of these fleets, and they're probably going to be all in the Pacific, because the Atlantic, the Russians don't have enough firepower to burst out of into the Atlantic. Their Black Sea fleet is a shell of itself, thanks to the Ukrainians. Their Baltic fleet is pretty much bottled up, and their North Sea fleet can easily be bottled up too. The Russian Pacific fleet is another one that's not as active. The Chinese have taken over from Russia as the biggest naval threat right now in the Pacific. The unmanned squadron are informally called ghost fleets, and Canada's finally studying the concept. Topsheet says they haven't figured out what percentage we want and the balance between manned and unmanned vessels. Well, given our recruitment problems right now, unmanned vessels seem like a good idea. Naval planners conducting a new fleet mix study are asking themselves a number of questions as they look at the different kinds of autonomous ships that could be available. What's the right mix as we replace our maritime coastal defense vessels down the road? What's the right capability for us, and how do we augment the Canadian surface combat, the next generation of warships? So he's talking about the frigates that we're going to get over the next decade, 2 decades. So they're looking beyond the remotely operated explosive packed speedboats that Ukraine has been using. I think the Iranians use those too. They have a bunch of those. It's looking at the larger vessels, such as the U.S. Navy's 145-ton C-100 minesweeper. Now that would be a good idea, minesweeper, but at the same time, minimally crewed minesweeper. Australia is already going to augment its crewed warships with unmanned vessels. The plan to bolster the Australian fleet includes unmanned 20 destroyers and frigates and 6 large optionally crewed surface vessels. 20 destroyers and frigates that are unmanned. That's a pretty big size. But then again, when you have an unmanned ship, you got to understand something. You can build a smaller vessel that packs just as much punch as a crewed vessel, because now you don't have to worry about crew quarters. You don't have to worry about housing a crew. You don't have to worry about having a galley, like a kitchen, so to speak, and dining hall. You don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. You don't need lifeboats. So you can actually play better with space and make them smaller. So it's the LSVs that piqued Topsheet's interest, and he thinks it's going to be a big part of the future. Hell, we have a lot of kids here who do nothing but play video games. Let them run a ship. All they need to do is sit in a room somewhere else and with a joystick. But think of it this way: you could have a big supply ship, fully manned supply ship, has the capability of launching 3 or 4 of these ghost ships in an area, and then move away from the area, or have them move out, and you can just control it with a joystick somewhere. Now the other problem with these is an EMP, an electronic pulse, will knock them out. But they can be armed with an EMP, with an electronic pulse, like you saw in Ocean's 11, a pinch. Play havoc with an opposing fleet or a coastal city. So this is something I'm all in for. We could build these things. It would save us on our recruitment problems right now. And they have a picture of the U.S. one here. 132-foot military ship sits at the maritime terminal in San Diego. They're lighter, which makes it harder to detect, and probably be faster too. When you take into account, they don't even need to be made with sturdy materials. If you can build a lot of these cheaply, you can overwhelm an enemy. So it's an interesting concept, and one that definitely has a lot of potential. So the next question is, where can we build these things? Currently, we're building our Arctic patrol ships and 2 more for the Coast Guard in Halifax at the Irving shipbuilding place. Now, they're working currently on the last of the Arctic patrol ships, and they're going to start the 2 Coast Guard ones, which are different variants. So they haven't even started the 15 new frigates yet. That'll be done after the Coast Guard ships. Now, the joint support ships are being built at Seaspan in Vancouver. Now, they're also building 2 Polar-class icebreakers for the Coast Guard. One to be built at Seaspan and the other at Davie, which is in Quebec. So Davie is not building anything. Davie should have been working on the frigates, but Seaspan is also going to work to replace the offshore oceanographic science vessel, and they're going to build the offshore fisheries science vessel, and 16 more multi-purpose vessels to be built at Seaspan for the Coast Guard. 6 medium icebreakers are going to be built at Davie for the Coast Guard. So the Coast Guard's getting a lot of new stuff, but only Halifax is building anything really for the Canadian Navy, like surface ships. But they're so far down the road. Now, they could use the Kiewit Offshore Services in Newfoundland as a major yard. The Washington Marine Group is a major yard. So those are 2. Now, New Dock in St. John's is another one they could use for fabrication services. When I was in St. John's recently, and the one thing I noticed is that St. John's Harbor is not very big. You could swim across it. It's not very wide. It's really small. But you can see here they have a dry dock here where you could build or fabricate stuff. And I think the ghost ships could be built here because they're not as big. 143 feet. Well, the size of the vessel that's already in there. Do they have the facilities? They used to. Newfoundland used to build ships all the time. So we could definitely use Newfoundland. And it's out of the way. So it'll keep people away from it. There's Signal Hill up there. So yeah, New Dock would be an area that could help build these ships. And I'm sure there's other ones. Toronto could even build these. Fabricate the pieces and put them together in somewhere else. So I am excited for that. And I do think that we need to get our defense spending up to the 2%. I don't see how hard it could be. Again, I would cut 4 and 8 in half. Stop wasting our taxpayer money on useless programs in other countries that we don't need. It doesn't help us. It does not beneficial in any way. And I'm personally tired of feeding all the beggars of the world. But anyway, Canadians out there, let me know what you guys think about our NATO commitment to defense and whether these ghost ships would be a good thing or not. Leave comments in the comment section. Until next time, this has been the Grey White North Report.